Good evening, everyone. I would like to call this meeting to order. First, we'll have our Committee Secretary, Mr. Jamison. Would you call the roll?
Senator Delnatje. Senator Goycochea. Senator Lang. Here. Assemblywoman Benitez Thompson.
Here.
Assemblyman Levitt. Here. Chair Miller.
Here. Thank you for that, and everyone is present. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third meeting of the Committee to Conduct an Investigation into Matters Relating to Reapportionment and Redistricting. I am Assemblywoman Brittany Miller, and I am pleased to serve as the chair of this committee. To all those in attendance, both here in person and virtually, I'd like to thank you for your interest, your engagement, and your participation in this important study. This is also the first interim meeting that we've had physically here in person in the legislative building. And so with that, I would like to recognize the work of our wonderful staff and team here, especially with broadcasting and production services, the IT team, as well as our legislative police, and Ms. Brenda Erdos and other staff who've been working diligently in order to make this meeting possible today. I have a few brief housekeeping items to go over before we begin the meeting. First, I'd like to thank everyone because everyone's wearing a mask, so thank you for your participation in that protection. We are meeting today in person, but we also have broadcasting live over our legislators' YouTube channel, live streaming over the web, and we are offering the standard call-in feature for public comment. And of course, we will also take public comment here in person. Meeting materials can be accessed on the committee's webpage. Anyone who would like to receive electronic notification or of and access to the committee's agenda, minutes, or final report can sign up on the Nevada Legislature's website. We will have two periods of public comment today, one at the beginning of the meeting and one at the end. We ask that each speaker keep their comments to 3 minutes per person, and it will be taken both in person in this room and over the telephone. In addition to those making public comment here in person, there are 4 ways to provide public comment, all of which are listed on the agenda. These include calling in on number 1-669-900-6833, then entering the meeting ID 856-3326-1783, followed by the pound sign. You may also email your comments to redistricting@lcb.state.nv.us. Mailing comments to the Research Division at 401 South Carson Street, Carson City, Nevada, 89701, or you may fax your comments to 1-775-684-6400. As always, this meeting will be recorded and available on the legislature's website for archived viewing on the Nevada Legislature's YouTube channel and over its streaming service. So with that, thank you for indulging me in a few housekeeping items, and I would like to move to our next agenda item, which is public comment. Again, we're asking that each speaker will be provided up to 3 minutes, and we encourage members of the public to submit written testimony via one of the methods listed on the agenda. As a reminder, we will have a second public comment at the end of the agenda as well. So with that, I would like to open up public comment to anyone here physically in the room that would like to make a public comment. Yes, please, sir. You can just come up and approach. And then we just ask that you state your first and last name and spell it for the record, and then you will have 3 minutes. We can hear you clearly right now. Thank you, sir.
My name is Eli Trimble, E-L-I-T-R-I-M-B-L-E. I am here in a personal capacity as a citizen of the state of Nevada. Using your online tools, I have submitted 3 redistricting plans, one for Congress, one for the state Senate, and one for the Assembly. Plans 268, 277, and 267, respectively. I implore you to consider them all carefully. My comments today are mostly going to be focused on the state legislative districts and not the congressional districts, because I assume that's where most of your attention will be focused, because it's most politically important these days. The legislative plans that I've proposed follow what I believe to be the most important criteria. The first being the preservation of city and municipal boundaries to the greatest extent possible. A focus on minority opportunity in line with overall state demographics. Specifically, newly drawn districts should allow for minority communities to send minority representatives to Carson City at a rate that is commensurate to their overall population in the state. And lastly, compactness. Generally speaking, I do not believe that community-based districts should be sacrificed for the sake of incumbents. Bringing communities together, especially after the disastrous 2010 cycle, is of greater concern than incumbent protection. The 2010 cycle was a pretty atrocious example of packing and cracking in the Reno-Sparks area, which I live in Sparks, hence why I'm here at the meeting in Carson City. The votes cast in the urban centers were deliberately diluted across northern Nevada for no reason other than partisanship. A particularly egregious example is SD 14, which pulls voters from urban and suburban Sparks neighborhoods and puts them into a district with rural communities as far as Winnemucca, Hawthorne, and Tonopah, over 200 miles away. My request is please make sure that the districts are compact, and please make sure that you have people from northern Nevada in the room with you as you are drawing these maps. Lastly, I encourage this committee to seriously consider recommending to the full legislature that you add seats during this redistricting cycle. The current number of legislators is 63 in total, 21 in the Senate, 42 in the Assembly, and that was set in 1983 after the 1980 census. The population at that time was 800,000. The population of the state has since increased by 288% to the current total of 3,105,000.
Sir, thank you, but that is your 3 minutes. So I invite you to you are more than welcome to submit your additional comments via any one of those, the email or fax or mailing it. Also, you're more than welcome to stay because we will have public comment again at the end of the agenda.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Not seeing anyone else here in the room that's approaching for public comment, I'd like to go to broadcasting. So BPS, do we have anyone on the line wishing to make public comment?
Thank you, Chair. It looks like we do have one caller. If you'd like to participate in public comment, please press *9 to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits, 130, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You have 3 minutes and you may begin.
Good evening, Chair and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Christine Saunders. That's CHRISTINE SAUNDERS, and I'm the Policy Director with the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada. Every 10 years, the state reaches a precipice where we have to redraw district boundaries. We cannot ignore the fact how much our state grew over the past decade and how much more diverse it is now. To do so, we run the risk of losing community voices at a time when it is most crucial to increase them. Across the country, we have even seen lines drawn to silence these communities. In addition, it is imperative that the state ensure that tribal nations are consulted in the redistricting process. We are pleased to see that for tomorrow's meeting, the committee will be discussing the impact of redistricting has on tribal nations in Nevada, and we hope that you will have these conversations with the tribal leaders from the northernmost points of the state to the southernmost. Nevada has been at the forefront of expanding access to the ballot box. I hope Nevada is also at the forefront of ensuring communities are not forgotten, overlooked, or ignored. Then we'll continue to monitor and engage with this committee and the legislature to ensure that communities can elect representatives that reflect our growth and diversity. Thank you.
Chair, the public line is open and working. However, there are no more callers at this time.
Thank you for that. I'd like to give it just another moment or two because just to make sure those people that are calling, because we are approaching the telephones pretty quickly at the beginning of this meeting, and I think sometimes people anticipate a little more time. So I just want to give it another minute if people still choose to call in. Broadcasting, does it appear that anyone is calling in?
Chair, the public line is open and working. However, there's still no callers at this time.
Okay, thank you for that. I will go ahead and close public comment, but would like to remind everyone that we will have public comment again at the end of this agenda. So, before our next agenda item, I'd like to note that the primary purpose of this committee is to educate the public and legislators on the reapportionment and redistricting process and give the public a chance to be heard on this important topic. Therefore, at this meeting and at our meeting tomorrow, LCB staff will review the basics of reapportionment and redistricting. Agenda item number 3, as well as on agenda item number 3, as well as the functions of our online redistricting applications, which are covered on agenda number 6. I know some of this may seem a bit repetitive, but again, it's important to make sure that the public has this information as we move forward through the redistricting cycle. And with that, we will move on to the next item, which our presenters, Mr. Michael Stewart and Mr. Ashard Killian, will present item number 3, which is the introduction to reapportionment and redistricting, its history, and the role of the Nevada State Legislature in redistricting. Please proceed when you are ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, Michael Stewart. I am the Research Director with Legislative Counsel Bureau and your committee policy analyst for this committee, and I'm pleased to be here for our third redistricting public hearing. And I say public hearing because one of the intents here is to educate the public. You all had a very similar presentation that Ash and I are about to give to you on Saturday. So, but do feel free to keep asking us questions if you'd like. But I know the public is listening, and I think hopefully they'll benefit from this presentation as well. So just a quick kind of introduction to reapportionment and redistricting. As you know, every 10 years, following the federal census, the Nevada State Legislature is responsible for reapportionment and redistricting the districts for the U.S. House of Representatives, the Nevada State Senate, the Nevada State Assembly, and the Nevada System of Higher Education, their Board of Regents. A lot of people kind of wonder, well, what is reapportionment and redistricting, and what does that mean? And honestly, those terms are used interchangeably often. So in its purest sense, apportionment is the division of a given number of elected members among established political subdivisions in accordance with an existing plan or formula. Perhaps the best example that we're most familiar with is the U.S. House of Representatives, which has 435 members. And those members are apportioned or reassigned among the states. So think of it as the allocation or reassignment of existing legislative districts to another part of the state. Redistricting, however, is the division of existing districts into new districts with different boundaries. For example, states with more than one member of the House of Representatives redistrict their apportioned members into new districts to achieve equal population. So think of redistricting as it pertains to redrawing the lines for election districts. So in short, reapportionment is a process of determining how many districts a jurisdiction will receive, and redistricting refers to the process of how new districts are being drawn within a particular jurisdiction. And I would note that the legislature can exercise both of these powers, but it does most commonly redistrict. And I'll turn it now over to Asher to handle some of the legal components of this. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Good evening, committee. It's great to see all of you in person again. While the next few subjects might be familiar to you as we discussed them just a few days ago, the intent of today's policy briefing is to give you, and more importantly the public who may be in attendance today, a quick primer on some of the basic legal concepts and practical considerations that the legislature should be familiar with going into this special session for redistricting. The topics I cover today will be a quite brief overview of the prevailing law, and at tomorrow's meeting in Fallon, we'll be discussing these issues in significantly more depth. The first thing you might be asking yourselves is, why is this our problem? You might not be surprised to learn that the answer is because the Nevada Constitution makes it your problem. Specifically, Article 4, Section 5 of the Nevada Constitution makes it the mandatory duty of the legislature, after each census, to do two things. First, to determine the number of legislators in the legislature, and second, to draw the district lines for those legislators. As you can see, this constitutional provision requires legislative districts to be established based on population, but gives you little other guidance on how these districts are to be drawn, leaving that to the legislature's discretion. That leads us to the first practical consideration to keep in mind. If we could go to the next slide. I know I said this on Saturday, but I still maintain that this is the most exciting slide in the entire presentation. That might just be because I was definitely not looking forward to drafting a bill with hundreds of pages of strings of numbers. Historically, Nevada's legislature has drawn district lines by requesting that the legal division draft a bill detailing an exhaustive list of all of the census geographies that are intended to fall within each legislative district, namely census tracts, census block groups, and census blocks. On the left of this slide, you can see a single section of a bill from the 2011 session that details the contents of a single assembly district. While this is what Nevada has traditionally done, there's no constitutional requirement that redistricting bills be structured in this way. And other states, like Minnesota, have taken advantage of advancements in technology to instead adopt what's known as a shapefile, which is a digital data file for geographic information system software that contains all the same information and can more easily be given a graphical representation. On the right side of this slide, you see the entirety of Minnesota's redistricting legislation from its 2011 session, a single section adopting a shapefile containing all districting data for the state. Minnesota's approach makes use of technology to avoid some of the technical bill drafting limitations of using a list of census areas. As you can probably imagine, long lists of numbers like we've typically used in Nevada create the potential for typographical errors, and checking and proofing these bills takes a significant amount of time and limits the speed with which the legal division can turn around bills containing a redistricting plan. Your staff is working diligently to consider Minnesota's approach and leverage technology to create a new style for redistricting legislation, which both improves readability for legislators and the public and reduces the technical barriers inherent in producing redistricting bills using Nevada's traditional approach. While we don't believe the result will go quite as far as Minnesota in reducing the entirety of redistricting to a single section reference to a data file, our goal is to leverage shapefiles to produce a bill that will contain a graphical representation of each Senate and Assembly district, rather than a list of census geographies, with the digital version of the bill containing a link to a permanent copy of the relevant shapefiles for public use and verification. Turning back to a review of the provisions of the Nevada Constitution which are relevant to redistricting, you'll see that the requirement to use census population as the basis for drawing lines is echoed in two additional places. Article 1, Section 13 requires representation to be apportioned by population, and Article 15, Section 13 requires that the census count be the basis for representation in both the Senate and the Assembly. Turning to the legislature's other mandatory duty, which is to fix the number of senators and assembly members, you'll see that the Constitution does provide a little more guidance on this topic. Specifically, the Constitution caps the total number of legislators at 75, and it requires the number of senators to be at least 1/3, but not more than 1/2 of the number of assembly members. This leads to the second practical consideration to keep in mind. Mr. Stewart will touch on this shortly, but one common theme for both the 2011 redistricting cycle and this current cycle is that Nevada's population has increased significantly over the past decade. Currently, the legislature has fixed the number of legislators at 63, with the maximum number of senators constitutionally permitted for that size at 21. Since the current number of 63 legislators is 12 under the constitutional cap, the legislature may wish to consider increasing the number of legislators to mitigate the increased population in each district as a result of this decade's population growth. Additionally, each Senate district has 2 assembly districts nested inside of it, which is made possible by the number of senators being at the constitutional cap of half of the number of assembly members. But this also results in an even number of assembly members, which creates the potential for a tie vote in the assembly. Increasing the number of assembly seats to an odd number would eliminate the possibility for a tie vote, but it would also eliminate your ability to nest assembly districts within Senate districts. As a note, the previous interim redistricting study considered this issue and recommended the retaining of the nesting of assembly districts within Senate districts. I'll now hand it back to Mr. Stewart to cover some of the history of redistricting in Nevada, challenges faced in previous cycles, and some useful statistics about redistricting in Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Killian. Again, Michael Stewart for the record. So just a little bit about our redistricting history. I'll kind of run through statehood until now, or until 2011, in about 5 minutes. So we'll see what we can do. So since statehood in 1864, there were several original provisions, as Mr. Killian noted, in the Constitution that really governed the composition of the legislature. And the first Nevada legislature consisted of 54 members, 18 senators and 36 assembly members. And from 1864 until 1919, the composition of the legislature changed 16 times, ranging from a low of 45 members from 1893 to 1899 to a maximum of 75 members from 1875 through 1879. So many of these changes likely resulted from population increases and decreases due to that boom and bust cycles of the mining industry and other important economic factors at that time. So as you can imagine, these constitutional provisions relating to population, they were actually routinely ignored in these early years from 1919 to 1965. The Senate, for example, was apportioned on the basis of 1 senator from each county, and the Assembly also had at least one representative from each county as well. And throughout this period, the Nevada Senate consisted of 17 members, 1 from each county. And the Assembly changed from 37 members in 1919 to 40 in 1931, 41 in 1945, 43 in 1947, 47 in 1951, and then back to 37 in 1961. So clearly a lot of fluctuation in the size of the legislature during these early years. In the 1960s, with legislative reapportionment, which was obviously based on the 1960 Decennial Census, that required drastic realignment of representation to account for the state's rapid population growth and increased concentration of population in Clark and Washoe counties. Now, while the Senate remained under the sort of little federalism model with 1 senator from each of the 17 counties, it became evident that only a reduction in the overall size of the Assembly would assure the best ratio of representation for the smaller counties. And therefore, a reapportionment plan was adopted in 1961 to reduce the Assembly from 47 to 37 members, as I mentioned. At that time, Clark and Washoe counties were given 24 Assembly members, 12 and 9 respectively, or about 57% of the Assembly, even though they contained about 75% of the state's population at that time. The 1961 reapportionment did not accomplish a redistricting that closely reflected population, but it indicated the legislature's recognition that population-based apportionment was becoming a crucial and nationwide issue. So this reapportionment plan from 1961 was challenged, however, in 1965. And a special legislative session was called in October 1965 that essentially paved the way for the establishment of that 1 person, 1 vote principle, which Mr. Killian will talk about here shortly, for equal representation. So in the 1970s, redistricting was a little less tumultuous, as there seemed to be a greater acceptance of the population-based apportionment. The legislature did, however, continue the use of multi-member districts. And also in the 1970s, the legislature moved from 60 members total, with 20 senators and 40 assembly members. In the 1980s, there seemed to be less conflict with reapportionment and redistricting, as key legislators from urban and rural parts of Nevada worked together to resolve differences and establish a general agreement that early on in that session, the size of the legislature would increase to its current size of 63 21 senators, and 42 assembly members. In 1990s, greater controversy did exist with the 91 round of reapportionment, and that was largely because Republican and Democratic margins were so close that both parties had to compromise. And they were also faced with huge population growth of the 1980s, especially in southern Nevada, which meant that representation, or seats, from the north would have to be shifted to the south. The 1990s also marked the beginning of computer mapping, thereby increasing the sophistication of the process. With the 2001 redistricting cycle, while it was made simpler due to technological advances, it was also challenging due to significant political and demographic factors. In 2001, the legislature remained at its current size of 63, and representation or seats from the north were shifted south. And another significant challenge was the addition of a new congressional seat for Nevada. So where do we stand now for 2011, your current legislative districts? So with legislators facing budget and revenue constraints, there seemed to be little desire at that time in 2011 to increase the size of the legislature. And there was a greater percentage of Senate and Assembly districts that would continue to shift seat-wise to southern Nevada, and again, to account for the notable population growth in Clark County. Also of note was the population of Nevada's Hispanic community, which more than tripled during the 1990s and nearly doubled during the first decade of the 2000s. And I would note that persons of Hispanic or Latino origin comprised over 26.5% of the total population in the 2010 census. And we'll hear a little bit more about census figures here later in this meeting. So with there were two redistricting measures that were approved in 2011. Senate Bill 497 and AB 556, and both bills were vetoed by the governor, and the legislature did not take up those bills to override or sustain the veto. And the governor at that time also indicated that he would not call the legislature into special session for redistricting to complete the task, and therefore that task fell to the courts. And First Judicial District Judge James Russell appointed 3 special masters to accomplish the redistricting exercise. And their report was completed, and their plans were submitted to the court on October 14th, 2011. And then the court asked for a few modifications and issued an order adopting and approving the special master's plan October 27th, 2011. So as you can imagine, probably some notable challenges in 2011 that I think we'll likely see today. A lot of these challenges tend not to change from decade to decade. And that, of course, includes the tremendous overall population growth that Nevada continues to see every census. And conversely, there have been some counties that have lost population. And so that poses some challenges as well. There is always increased influence of communities of interest, whether that be ethnic groups, urban, rural, etc. And we've talked a little bit about communities of interest and the tool now that's being offered on the My Districting app, so people can really help identify those as they're making their maps through the application. The impact of term limits is notable, particularly on institutional knowledge and on the reallocation of legislative districts. Every decade now, we're finding that fewer and fewer legislators have experienced redistricting from one decade to the next, largely due to term limits. The size of the legislature is always a consideration, so that might be something the legislature might consider. And then there's always the potential for the creation of multiple ballot styles due to overlapping non-coterminous district boundaries. As you start overlaying those boundaries from one map to the other, you end up with potential for multiple ballot styles, which could be challenging for our local election officials. And then finally, as you know, if this were to happen during session, and I think it's probably rings true even now, this is a compressed time frame amid other important legislative matters. So let me tell you a few quick statistics. In 2011, each member at that time represented, and again, that's a snapshot in time based on the 2010 census, each assembly member represented about 64,299 residents. The ideal population for the 2021 redistricting cycle for assembly districts is 73,919. So that's the targeted ideal population for assembly. In 2011, each member of the Senate represented represented about 128,598 residents, and the target ideal population for 2021 is 147,839. Just a few other quick statistics. All the assembly districts are nested in the Senate districts, as Mr. Killian pointed out. And there were no more multi-member Senate districts, meaning the Senate districts were then renumbered from 1 to 21. The Senate has 15 districts wholly within Clark County, 4 districts in the Washoe County, Carson City area, one of which includes 5 counties in western Nevada, and then 2 rural districts. The Assembly also includes 30 districts representing Clark County and 6 districts entirely within Washoe, 6 districts in rural Washoe County, and the remaining rural counties. And then finally, as you know, minority populations continue to increase, notably in most of our legislative districts. For congressional, we achieved a 4th congressional seat in 2011, and they established 4 distinct geographical areas: Northern Nevada, which is Congressional District 2, Central and Northern Clark County, which is Congressional District 4, Las Vegas Urban Core area is Congressional District 1, and Southern Clark County is District 3. And at that time, the ideal population for Districts 1, 2, and 3 was 675,138, and District 4, because we had an odd number of Nevada residents, was 675,137. And I would note that the Urban Core District at that time included a Hispanic or Latino population of 43%. So, and except for Clark County, Lyon County is the only county that's divided in this current redistricting plan for congressional districts. The number that the legislature would be shooting for ideal population for 2021 for congressional district is 776,154. And finally, as you know, the legislature does draw lines for the Nevada System of Higher Education's Board of Regents. That's a 13-member board, which was increased from 11 members in 2001. You heard a report from Mr. Reynolds of NSHE on Saturday, and as he pointed out, their plan that they're at least submitting for your consideration and still retains that 13-member board, and the ideal population that they have identified in that plan is 238,816 for each district of the Board of Regents. And finally, I'll point out that the State Board of Education is, in 2011, the legislature approved a bill to change the way that they're selected. And so it's now sort of a hybrid board with 4 members elected by the voters in each congressional district and the remaining members appointed. And so I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Killian to take us home on this one.
Thank you, Michael. Again, Asher Killian, Chief Deputy Legislative Counsel and Committee Counsel for the record. Now I'm going to quickly cover some of the important federal constitutional provisions and case law relating to redistricting. First, Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution apportions seats in the U.S. House among the states on the basis of census population. While Nevada's population has grown, the census found that it didn't grow enough to gain an additional seat, so Nevada was still apportioned 4 seats in the House for this cycle. Since Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution requires state legislatures to prescribe the time, place, and manner of holding elections for the U.S. House, you'll also have the responsibility to draw district lines for those 4 seats. Additionally, Section 2 of the 14th Amendment contains the Equal Protection Clause. The United States Supreme Court has held this clause to be the basis of the concept of one person, one vote, which means that each voter's vote should carry a roughly equal weight, regardless of where the voter lives. This concept is responsible for the requirement of equal population in election districts, both for Congress and for state legislative districts. As Mr. Stewart mentioned, before 1962, constitutional provisions regarding redistricting were routinely ignored, both nationwide and in Nevada. And the U.S. Supreme Court sanctioned this malapportionment by considering redistricting to be a political matter and refusing to enforce either the U.S. or state constitutions. You'll see three cases listed at the end of this slide. For the sake of brevity, we're not going to discuss them in detail tonight, but these are the major cases in which the U.S. Supreme Court decided to abandon its traditional rule, which is that it declined to step into the political thicket and get involved in electoral matters, and instead decided that the malapportionment which results from the failure of state legislatures to redistrict on the basis of census population is now a justiciable matter, and that redistricting plans will be held unconstitutional if they don't assign relatively equal weight to each voter's vote. If you'd like a little light bedtime reading, once again, you're welcome to pull up those cases and help yourself snooze. For the sake of brevity during this meeting, we're not going to get into each of the issues on the next slide in depth, but there are a few additional legal items relating to redistricting that you should be aware of. While the legislature has the power to consider what rules and principles it will choose to follow in drawing district lines, there are two requirements imposed by federal law which are mandatory. First, as just discussed, is the one person, one vote principle established by Baker v. Carr and subsequent cases. And second is the prohibition in the Voting Rights Act against districting that denies a racial or language minority an equal opportunity to participate in the electoral process. Adherence to the one person, one vote principle is measured by a different standard depending on whether congressional districts or state legislative districts are being drawn. For congressional districts, the U.S. Supreme Court has decided that equality of population is the paramount consideration, generally allowing a deviation from the ideal population in each district of not more than plus or minus a single voter. For state legislative districts, however, the requirements are far less severe, with the court creating a presumption that a deviation from the ideal population of more than plus or minus 5% is malapportioned, while a deviation of less than plus or minus 5% is presumed to be permissible so long as there's some legitimate basis for the deviation, which could be a variety of things, such as respecting underlying city or county boundaries, keeping communities of interest intact, compactness, or a variety of other reasons. Adherence to the requirements of the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment regarding equal opportunities for racial or language minorities is a considerably more complex matter. Case law regarding the Voting Rights Act simultaneously prohibits creating minority-majority districts where such districts cannot be feasibly drawn in a reasonably compact manner, but also prohibits failing to draw such a district if a reasonably compact district can be drawn with concrete evidence of both political cohesion among members of the minority group and block voting against the minority group by members of the majority. Functionally, this means that this is a complex area of law without many hard rules, and it can frequently be the source of challenges to districting plans. Additionally, practices which dilute the impact of minority groups, such as packing more members of the group into a district than are necessary to decide an election in order to limit the number of districts that members of the minority group can affect, or cracking members of a minority group among several districts to prohibit them from having an impact on any individual district, are prohibited. In addition to these two mandatory principles for redistricting, there are a variety of traditional redistricting principles that the legislature may choose to follow in drawing district boundaries, and we'll cover those in just a minute. Note, however, that these principles may often conflict with each other, which requires the legislature to either choose to prioritize certain principles or to determine how to balance the principles against each other. One other issue that has drawn significant interest lately after the recent Rucho v. Common Cause Supreme Court case is the issue of whether partisan gerrymandering is permissible. Briefly, before Rucho, the federal courts would hear cases under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution regarding whether drawing district lines to the advantage of one political party at the expense of another unconstitutionally denied members of the disadvantaged party the opportunity to participate in the political process. In Rucho, the Supreme Court decided that such claims under the federal Constitution were political questions and that the federal courts would no longer consider those claims. Rucho explicitly left open the possibility for partisan gerrymandering to be challenged in state courts if some independent basis for the claim exists pursuant to a state constitutional provision. A little over half of states have what's called a free and equal elections clause in their state constitutions, and those clauses are generally interpreted as a requirement that elections be free from political influence, and those clauses create a basis to challenge partisan gerrymandering. However, Nevada's Constitution does not have such a clause, and the Equal Protection Clause in Article 4, Section 21 of Nevada's Constitution is generally interpreted in the same manner as the federal Equal Protection Clause, which the court held in Rucho to not be a basis for partisan gerrymandering challenges. Therefore, it is unlikely that a partisan gerrymandering claim would succeed in a Nevada court. Additionally, there are certain emerging trends in redistricting challenges that I wanted to bring to your attention. In challenges regarding potential racial gerrymandering and the drawing of minority-majority districts, courts are increasingly requiring a showing of facts beyond race that indicate that a community of interest actually exists. In other words, that the minority-majority group in question actually does vote together. As an example, if you consider a potential minority-majority district that is 60% Asian, but of that Asian population, 55% is Korean, 35% is Chinese, and 10% is Vietnamese, and each of those communities tends to support a different candidate, the actual effect of drawing that 60% Asian minority-majority district would be to disenfranchise the Chinese and Vietnamese communities to the benefit of the Korean community. It's becoming increasingly common for the courts to require some sort of social science analysis to be done and concrete evidence to be submitted to support the existence of a community of interest when drawing a minority-majority district. In addition, given the improvements in technology, it's possible for a computer to draw millions of potential plans in seconds, which means it's possible, if not likely, that you'll have large numbers of maps submitted to you. And the analysis of large batches of data like that requires specialized knowledge. As a result, it's possible that you'll see political scientists and other social scientists participating in this process in a much more significant way than they may have participated in cycles in the past. Finally, before we open it up to any other questions the committee might have, I'm going to familiarize you with several of the most commonly recognized traditional districting principles. First is compactness, which is a measure of how closely packed a district is. This is meant to discourage districts from being drawn to be unusual or elongated shapes and to encourage denser, more uniform districts. Second is contiguity, which means that all points in the district must connect with each other somehow. Third is the preservation of counties and other political subdivisions, such as cities, towns, or districts. And fourth is the related concept of preservation of communities of interest, which is a broader idea that can include things such as neighborhoods, racial or ethnic groups, college students, or any other group that shares some sort of common policy interest. Fifth is the preservation of the cores of prior districts, which captures the concept of maintaining the status quo for voters in terms of who represents them and how they are grouped. Sixth is the protection of incumbents, which captures the idea that incumbent legislators originally elected in different districts should not be newly forced to compete against each other in the same district where possible. And then finally is compliance with the Voting Rights Act, which we just discussed as a mandatory principle in addition to being a traditional principle. Several other districting principles have been emerging in other states in recent years, such as electoral competitiveness, which aims to maximize the number of districts in which an election is likely to be close, prohibitions on partisan data, which aim to reduce or eliminate the consideration of political implications when drawing district lines, and prohibitions on either the favoring or disfavoring of candidates, incumbents, or political parties, which relates to the partisan gerrymandering issue discussed previously. As you can see, many of these principles do conflict. For example, if you're trying to preserve a city or a county that itself is an unusual size, it can be difficult to draw a compact district. If you're trying to preserve a community of interest that's too big for one district but not big enough for two, it can be difficult to get close to the equal population for the district and might require the community of interest or some political subdivision to be split. If a particular racial or ethnic group has grown in part of an area that spans multiple existing districts to the point that it might require a minority-majority district, this could require the core of previous districts to be split, or for incumbents who are both in the affected area to be paired against each other. It's important to remember that no district is drawn in a vacuum. All districts have to be drawn as part of a statewide whole. And in a state where the vast majority of the population lives in two urban cores, this alone can require counties to be split, or for some districts to be so geographically small as a result of dense population that the underlying physical geography of streets and neighborhoods creates unusual shapes. Ultimately, it's up to the legislature to determine how to exercise its judgment to prioritize and balance these principles to create a set of maps that work for the state. At this point, we'd be happy to take any questions you may have about the basics of redistricting, and I'll just note that staff contacts for your redistricting team are on the slide before you, and you're welcome to reach out to us anytime with any questions you may have.
Thank you. Members, do we have any questions? All right, not seeing any questions. Not seeing any questions, thank you. And again, for us, this is our second time seeing it, so we're absorbing it and picking up other points. Thank you so much. Not seeing any questions, I will go ahead and close this agenda item and open the agenda item for number 4 for the next presentation, Mr. Killian, we're going to have you stay as you're presenting it with Ms. Prowl, who is also approaching. Mr. Lawton, our state demographer, is presenting via Zoom. And this agenda item is an update on the adjustment of the 2020 census population totals for the purposes of redistricting to reflect the reallocation of inmates pursuant to Assembly Bill 450 from 2019.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Asher Killian, Chief Deputy Legislative Counsel and Committee Counsel for this study. Thank you for allowing us to present on Assembly Bill 450 from 2019. And thank you for getting my introductions out of the way for me. I'm joined by Haley Prohl, who's a Senior Policy Analyst and GIS Specialist in the Research Division of LCB, as well as Matt Lawton via Zoom, who is our State Demographer. So I'm going to kick this off real quick by just giving you a brief description of the contents of AB 450 from 2019. Basically, AB 450 from 2019 imposed duties on 3 different entities, specifically the Department of Corrections, the State Demographer, and the legislature itself. The duty imposed on the Director of the Department of Corrections was to compile the last known residential address of each offender immediately before the offender was sentenced to imprisonment in a facility or institution of the Department of Corrections, and to provide all relevant information to the state demographer to carry out his duty. The duty imposed on the state demographer was to revise the population counts for each census tract, census block group, and census block in the state to reapportion back any inmate who was a Nevada resident before incarceration to their permanent address rather than the prison address. And then finally, the duty that was imposed upon the legislature was to use these revised population counts, which move prisoners who are Nevada residents back to their home addresses rather than the prison address, as the basis for representation for legislative districts, for congressional districts, and for districts for the Board of Regents of the University of Nevada. These duties became effective on July 1st, 2019. As the legislature, obviously, this is the first time you're running into it because it's the first time we've redistricted since July 1st, 2019. But both the Department of Corrections and the State Demographer have been under their obligation to carry out the duties imposed by this act since July 1st of 2019. And now I'll hand it over to Haley to go through some of the details of the technical side of this reallocation process.
Actually, I think these are my slides.
To Matt, I'm sorry.
Matthew Lawton. Yeah, no problem. Matthew Lawton, Nevada State Demographer, Department of Taxation. Good evening. I'm fairly recent into the position, so my predecessor, Mr. Hardcastle, initiated the contact with Department of Corrections for the initial files that were provided. I came on board toward the end of the process, but I can summarize what was received by my office. Going back to February, the initial data file that was received from the Department of Corrections included 12,214 inmate records. Among those records, 7,501 of them contained some form of a last known address. So 4,713 did not have that information. Among the 7,501, there was about 5,500 of them that appeared to have some potential to be locatable through address geocoding. Some of them didn't have enough detail or specificity to be able to do that. Through communication with corrections, another file was received on July 1st of 2021. This included 1,672 data records. There were no new inmate records included, but it did include some supplemental information for about 697 of those inmate records that provided some additional address information that was not provided in the first data file. And then lastly, we received a third file on July 28th that consisted of 973 records. Again, no new inmate records specifically, but there was some more clarification on the records previously provided. There were 643 records that provided clarification on in-state last known addresses, and there were 287 records that had an identifiable in-state parole address for those inmate records. Through coordination with LCB, we had set a July 30th deadline with corrections for receiving data, just to allow the time necessary to prepare the data for the redistricting process. However, by the third file, it was clear corrections had, provided as much data as they were able to provide for the information in the data files. So moving on to the next slide, what we actually received through those 3 data files were several different types of addresses. The initial file had what was called the previous address, and this was simply the inmate address prior to arrest. Again, it wasn't complete for every record, but it was included for those records that where it was indicated. In the subsequent files, in the second file, there was an additional field that was provided called a no fixed address. And what this was an address that was pertained to the inmate prior to incarceration, where they lived temporarily, perhaps with roommates or with a relative. Or in some situations, it was the address of a shelter or a similar type of facility. And then we had a third field that identified a planned parole address from the inmate. So this was the location that the inmate indicated that they intended to live during their parole. And then lastly, there was a field that identified what was called a resident address. And this was an address that was recorded when an inmate's spouse or family had relocated from the previous address since the inmate's incarceration. So obviously there was some question as to the order of precedence of these addresses and how they should be used for this reallocation effort. Obviously, statute didn't provide really any clarity on how that was to happen. So based on consultation with counsel from LCB and also from the Department of Taxation, this was the order of precedence that was determined. The previous address, if it was locatable, that was the first order of data to be used. If that was not available, but there was an identifiable address in the no fixed address field, then that was used for the reallocation for the inmate record. If neither the previous address nor the no fixed address were specifically locatable, but there was some indication that the inmate record was in state prior to incarceration. Some of them had city names, county names, zip codes that could be identified as in state. Then the planned parole address was used for those records. It was felt that that was fulfilling the intent of the legislation to do that. And then lastly, the resident address was not used because that was not a location that the inmate necessarily was linked to prior to incarceration. So that was not used in the reallocation. So moving on to the next slide, a little bit further explanation of that distinction between in-state versus out-of-state. As I mentioned, if we couldn't locate by the previous or the no fixed address, but we did find some sort of linkage that was in-state, city name, county, zip code, PO box, then we could use that parole address for reallocation. But if there was no identifiable record showing an in-state location prior to incarceration, then that inmate count was kept back at the correctional facility for which they were counted during the census on April 1st, 2020. So obviously that there's no clarification in statute on how to necessarily handle that scenario. So that's a remaining question as to whether those inmates should be counted at the facility or perhaps excluded from the count entirely. So the next slide kind of summarizes the recommendations for the next go around, at least from my office's perspective. So there were some challenges with data quality. Corrections provided as much information as they were able to provide, but obviously having complete records probably would have given us a higher matching rate for addresses. So for the next decennial cycle, data quality is probably an initiative that should be looked at. Also clarifying that order of precedence of the addresses. Going into this, we weren't expecting there to be multiple types of addresses tied to the inmate. So perhaps some clarification as to what types of addresses should be applied to the reallocation process. And then also that guidance on inmate records that cannot be allocated either because they had no address record or they were out of state. Should they be counted back at the correctional facility? Should they be excluded entirely from the count? So some direction and guidance on that would be helpful for the next effort. So with that, I will pass it over to LCB to conclude the presentation.
Thank you, Matthew. For the record, Haley Prohl, Senior Policy Analyst and GIS Specialist at the Research Division of LCB. I'm going to go over the process by which the inmates were reallocated and touch on the results as well. So to get the inmate address data into the redistricting database, the address data first had to be geocoded. Geocoding is a process that takes address data and turns it into coordinate points. Geocoding determines which census blocks and other geography areas that inmates are added to and subtracted from. NDOC facilities were also geocoded. To help with this process, the U.S. Census Bureau provided a free geocoder for states to reallocate their inmates, but geocoding can also be performed through GIS. Geocoding is a very accurate tool with proper data inputs, but there are limitations if the address inputs are not complete or if there are errors. So there are a few reasons that addresses may not geocode. The first is an incomplete address, for example, missing a zip code or a street number. If there were obvious errors, this was corrected so that it could be geocoded. In many cases, inmate addresses included just the county name or state, and we unfortunately couldn't geocode those. They were too incomplete. Another reason addresses may not geocode are address errors, incorrect zip code or street number, or a typo in a street name. And again, if that error was obvious, that was corrected so that it could be geocoded. There are some non-geocodable address types, including P.O. boxes and often commercial buildings. The underlying street data in geocoders often refer to residential addresses only. And the final reason is address formatting errors. So if there were line breaks or extra or missing spaces, that can mess up the geocoder, but those were also easily fixed as well. So taking a look at the results of the inmate reallocation, all said and done, out of the 12,214 records, 6,275 inmates were reallocated, or 51.5%. This slide contains a breakdown of all the records received from NDOC. There were 894 inmate address records that were out of jurisdiction. 860 were out of state prior to incarceration, and those inmates were counted at the facilities. They were not reallocated. There were also just a few inmates who were counted not in NDOC facilities. On Census Day, 34 inmates were counted at places such as a county jail, hospital, or medical facility, or a district court. And NDOC included these inmates in the file because it was unsure whether all county jails and hospitals completed their census counts on the same night, but ultimately these were not reallocated because AB 450 defines an inmate as someone who is incarcerated in a facility or institution of NDOC. About 4,326 inmate address records were unknown. 2,927 did not have a valid address, and there was an additional subset, 1,399, who had a valid parole address, but it was determined since they could not be verified for sure that they were residents of the state prior to incarceration, this parole address would not be used. So this bottom subset of in-state addresses is what we're really looking at for the reallocation, and those rows highlighted in green are what were able to be geocoded ultimately and reallocated. 5,592 had a valid address, and 683 had a valid parole address. And again, in total, 6,275 inmates were able to be reallocated. The following slides include reallocation results at the current district and county levels. So for congressional districts, the impact of this reallocation ranged from a negative 0.31% change to a positive 0.34% change. Congressional District 1 had the highest percent change, that is in the Las Vegas core. Congressional District 4 had the largest negative percent change, that is a Central Nevada district that includes the counties Esmeralda, Lincoln, Mineral, Nye, part of Lyon, and part of Clark County. For the Board of Regents, the impact of the adjustment was an overall range of minus 1.45% to positive 0.43%. District 5 of the current Board of Regents districts had the largest percent change. That is also in the Las Vegas core. Board of Regents District 8 had the largest negative percent change. That's, again, a rural district. It includes the counties Elko, Eureka, Humboldt, Lincoln, Nye, White Pine, and part of Clark County. For the Senate districts, the overall range in percent change was negative 2.4 to positive 0.56%. Senate District 4 had the largest positive percent change. That is in the North Las Vegas area. And Senate District 19 had the largest negative percent change. That is a rural district with counties Elko, Eureka, Lincoln, Nye, White Pine, and part of Clark County. The impact on the assembly districts is similar to the other district types. The overall range of the impact of the reallocation is from negative 3.45% to positive 0.75%. And Assembly District 6 had the largest positive percent change. That is a district in the North Las Vegas area. And Assembly District 36 had the largest negative percent change, and that is a rural district with parts of Nye, Lincoln, and Clark counties. And in terms of the impact on counties, the overall range was from negative 9.68% to positive 0.23%. And Nye had the largest overall percent change, and Pershing had the largest negative percent change. The adjusted numbers from the inmate reallocation is the data set that is in the desktop redistricting software, as well as the public redistricting application, My Districting Nevada. This adjusted data set is also available for download as a standalone data set in Excel format on the legislator's redistricting website. That link is on this slide. And one other thing of note is that only the total population field was adjusted due to this reallocation, and no other census data fields, including any race, Hispanic or Latino, or voting age population fields were adjusted. There was not enough data to accurately and feasibly adjust any other census data fields. And with that, that concludes our presentation, and we're happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Members, do we have any questions? Okay, I will start with, we have a few questions. First, I do understand that Ms. Livingston from the Department of Corrections is here. Would you be able to come up and, because I'm not sure if the questions are the specific for, yes, please come up. And then that way, I forget, can we just alternate seats and be prepared, because I'm not sure which questions will be for LCB and which ones will be for the Department of Corrections. So Senator Donate, your question, please.
Thank you so much, Chair. I guess I just have a really quick clarification for NDOC, the representatives from there. So to clarify, NDOC turned over, one second, let me just go back up to the demographic count. So NDOC turned over almost 12,214 records. Is there a potential that there are probably more folks that weren't turned over as part of the count? Is that a potential, or is that the total count that you had at that time when you did the collection?
Please state your name.
I'm sorry about that. For the record, my name is Alejandra Livingston. I work for the Nevada Department of Corrections. I am an economist 3. I'd like to clarify that it was agreed that Census Day for group quarters nationwide was scheduled to take place April 1, 2020 at midnight. So the count that was provided to the state demographer and the redistricting team was the same count and the same offenders that were accounted for on census night. Yeah, so it is not my assumption that any inmates would have been left out. However, what I have to say about counts is that because of COVID-19, our prison population probably would have been somewhat higher at that time than perhaps in April of the prior year, simply because the number of admissions was going down because of COVID. Yes.
Chair, may I follow up?
Yes, please.
Thank you. I guess the reason why I'm asking that is I'm looking at the unknown addresses, and I'm interested in hearing what NDOC did following up when you learned of some of the records that had no valid addresses and what the follow-up was beyond that. That's pretty much what I wanted a further clarification.
Yes, I think that one of the issues of concern that I would have, and probably from our IT department, is that they were under the impression that when we met with the team, and we asked what types of addresses we should provide. And what I'd like to clarify that the reason why we have so many addresses that are collected, in part because the computer system that we have, which is called Notice, was created by a Canadian firm called Syscon, and it provides the opportunity to enter many address types. And the reason we collect that many address types is because for investigative purposes. So not only because we want to know where to forward mail to the inmate when the inmate is released, but also in case of the inmate escapes, if there is some other kind of investigation that needs to be conducted, so that the inmate that the department and the investigators in our department have access to all that information. So it is possible that there were blanks in, let's say, the street address and no blanks for the inmate in the previous address, or maybe there were no blanks in the planned parole address, but blanks in the mailing address. So that could have been the issue. So when we offered the data, it was assumed that which address types would have the most data, those were the ones to be provided to the team. However, As far as the quality of that information, I was not aware really until it was provided to them. But many efforts were made to try to provide them with as, fewer data points as possible. And as they explained, a lot of the data were not accurate, and we don't have really the ability to determine whether an address is accurate or not. One of the challenges that we have is that the inmate demographic information is collected during the intake process, and it's all self-reported. So even the information that is in the pre-sentence investigation report, which does not always come with the inmate, sometimes we receive it later or we don't receive it at all, that's all self-reported. So, and before the inmate is transported to a state facility, that inmate most likely lived in a jail before. The inmate was waiting to go through a court hearing or awaiting the trial process, and maybe he spent several months or a year in there. Most of these individuals don't have the lifestyles that many of us have, so they're transient people. They don't have necessarily a set address where they lived. But I would like to provide some clarification, maybe a little bit outside the question being asked, as far as the meaning of the addresses. The resident's address could be either the previous address or the inmate's current address or future address. So if there is still a relative, a family of that inmate living there, that's still a valid address. And no fixed address, yes, that is used for inmates that are in transient status. That could be a shelter and so forth. The planned parole address is collected when the inmate is starting to plan the parole process. Whether that information is going to be accurate or not depends on many factors. Perhaps when the inmate is getting ready to go to a parole hearing, that inmate has to have a parole plan, and that means he has to know where he's going to live. But it is found later that that is not an acceptable place where the inmate could live because of restrictions, or maybe the relative or friend declined to have that person in their house. So I noticed too that there was something mentioned about jails and hospitals. So when inmates go to a jail or a hospital, that's totally temporary. Sometimes inmates have to go to hearings, so they might be absent from a prison for a couple of nights. The same if they become seriously ill and they have to be transported to a hospital. So on census night, we were told by the U.S. Census Bureau that we did not need to account for them because jails and hospitals were also going to be participating in the census. But they are actually felony inmates. So we have other challenges too with the addresses. One of them is that we used to have another computer system a number of years ago, a DOS-based system, and a lot of the fields did not convert over correctly. But when we learned that there were a lot of missing data points in the data sets that we provided to the redistricting team, we did make a significant effort to try to provide them with any information that we had. In fact, some of us looked up zip codes, and we noticed that zip codes were missing numbers and so forth, and we actually spent a lot of time doing that. And my division, the Offender Management Division, sent memoranda to all the inmates that had missing data, and they interviewed them if they were still housed. So because the census was done in April, some of them were no longer housed at our facilities, and they were interviewed in person. Very few of them also refused to provide that information. We cannot force them to provide it. And we also had one dedicated staff who actually pulled hard copy files and try to find documents whenever possible. But we are committed to improving in this capacity, and we're willing to work with the redistricting team to improve the quantity and quality of data provided. We are already working closely with our IT division to try to streamline the number of addresses available in that system, and we're starting to train our intake staff on how to utilize those addresses and making sure that those addresses are current. But if we interview an inmate who is 90 years old, who is serving a life sentence, and who has been in prison for 40 years, and we ask that person, what was your previous address? There isn't always a good chance that the address that that person will provide will be accurate. And there are inmates that have language barriers and inmates that have intellectual deficiencies too, or a history of substance abuse and so forth. So we cannot always rely on them providing us with precise information, unfortunately. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Senator Goicoechea, do you still have your question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess I'm as concerned as anything about, it looks like about 6,000 inmates haven't been reallocated, and so they will be listed wherever they're housed. Is that correct?
That would be, I'm sorry, but that would be a good question perhaps for, I'm not sure who makes that decision, I apologize. But if they will not be reallocated, I mean, if there is anything that we can still do to collect more information, we can certainly try to do so if it's still doable.
Well, I'm just looking at the final reallocation count, and it shows 6,275 or 51% were reallocated. So I'm assuming the rest of them are wherever they're housed. And I guess what concerns me, I'm not really concerned about the impact it has on say, Assembly or Senate races, but what concerns me is it has a huge impact on the census numbers for some of these rural counties, especially look at Pershing at 10% hit, White Pine at a 5% hit, and just the normal fluctuation in inmates in both of those facilities, the medium security in Pershing County or the max in White Pine, and that maximum security in White Pine, if we were back at the old system, was going to be off almost 600 people right there, which is, again, a huge hit. So that fluctuation does matter in these small rural counties, especially when they use those numbers to apply for other, federal funds, state funds. That's their total population of the jurisdictions. So I am kind of concerned about where those 6,000. I hear you. If a person is in the max in Ely and doing 40 years to life, that's probably going to be his residence for a couple of cycles. So.
Yeah, in the past, I mean, when we work with the counties and we provide them with counts for various county governments that they contact us for planning purposes or for census, they assume that the inmate's place of residence is the prison. So if the person is housed at Ely State Prison, that person is accounted for as being a White County resident.
Right. I thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just, wanted to point out there are still some questions. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, please.
Asher Killian, Chief Deputy Legislative Counsel. So the requirement in law, in NRS 360-288, the duty imposed on the demographer is to reallocate those inmates if and only if the demographer can confirm that they were Nevada residents before incarceration. So there are two different sources of data that are necessary. Even if the demographer has an address that he could potentially reallocate them to, if there's not proof that the person was a Nevada resident before incarceration, the demographer does not have the authority to reallocate them. So since they were counted by the census at the prison site, they have to remain counted at the prison site. Similarly, if the data isn't sufficient for the demographer to make a judgment of what the inmate, what the inmate's address was before incarceration, then the demographer also doesn't have the information necessary to reallocate them. So again, in that instance, they would have to be counted where they were counted by the census, which is at the prison site. So there are a significant number of inmates who will remain counted at the prison site, either because there's insufficient evidence that they were Nevada residents before incarceration or insufficient evidence of their address in general. And the demographer doesn't have the authority to reallocate any of those inmates unless those two conditions are met.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. We have a question from Vice Chair Lang.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm glad this was brought up tonight because we had some questions about it at our meeting in Las Vegas. And I have the same concerns that Senator Goicoechea has about the people that weren't counted. This bill, I wasn't here, but it was passed in 2019, and here we are in 2021. With half of the people we aren't being able to identify. So that's problematic to me because I would like to see everyone counted. I also have a question for Mr. Killian. I think is the best person. So I'm just curious in this bill if we also count Nevadans that are in out-of-state prisons.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Asher Killian, Chief Deputy Legislative Counsel, through you to the Senator. This bill does not in any way import census populations from other states. If a person was incarcerated in another state and reported in the census as being a resident of that other state, there's no mechanism in this bill to import that population back into Nevada. So those people would not be counted in Nevada. They may or may not be counted in the state that they're incarcerated in, depending on that state's laws. 11 states have laws like AB450 that reallocate inmates to their home addresses. The majority of those states, if the inmate is actually an out-of-state resident, simply do not count those inmates for districting purposes. Nevada is one of the minority of states that do continue to count that person at the prison site rather than not counting them at all.
Great, thank you. Follow-up, please.
Yes, please.
And the other thing that was mentioned that I'm curious about is, I think you said that jails and hospitals are counted separately.
Well,
Or could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So on census night, April 1, 2020, if the inmate was housed at a jail or a hospital, then that inmate was not accounted for in the decennial census. Yes, because the U.S. Census Bureau indicated that we shouldn't because jails and hospitals were going to their own census. And nationwide, all group quarters were going to have their census on April 1. Yes. So they were accounted for in the census, but not as being in our facility.
And we're sure that happened.
I am not sure. We would have to contact each one of the jails in the state and find out if that was done that night.
Okay,
But very few people are in a jail or in a hospital on a given night, maybe less than 100 people, maybe 40 people at the most. But we have their information, so I believe that it was provided as well, or maybe not, but we can provide that information.
Thank you. And I guess my last question is, what steps is Corrections taking to get the rest of these addresses that we're missing?
Well, as I explained earlier, we are willing to work with the redistricting team to try to improve the quality of the data. We have some problems that are beyond our control. Like I was explaining, it's self-reported data. For some inmates, we have very little documentation, unfortunately, but we can certainly work with the redistricted team. My division is currently working on a training module for the intake staff to teach them how to better utilize the information. However, there is always a chance that the inmate may decline in giving that information. We are also working with our IT division to correct some of the issues that were found where the delimiters probably were not aligned correctly. Another challenge that we have is that there is a database embedded in our system where what caseworkers are telling me is that when the inmate provides, let's say, a city where they used to live, they enter that information in the computer, and it populates perhaps a state that we know does not match. Like it might say that Sacramento is in Nevada. So if the case manager that's entering the information knows that Sacramento is in California, that person can correct the information. But if it's a city that is not well known and whatever the computer pops up, that's what goes in. So there are challenges with that. So we would like to work with the state demographer and with the GIS analyst at LCB in helping us with that problem. We would appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And we would encourage you to continue to strive to do that, because really these concerns for our inmates extend past census and redistricting. And so we would encourage you to continue on that.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
will. We will.
Any additional questions? All right, seeing no additional questions, thank you so much, Ms. Livingston, Ms. Prowl, Mr. Killian. And I will go ahead and close that agenda item, and we will move on to our next agenda item, agenda item 5, which is the overview of demographic products involving census data from Nevada's Office of the State Demographer and discussion of the 2020 census population trends in Nevada. As you know, one of the charges for this committee set forth comes from SCR 3, and it requires a review of the census data. So Mr. Lawton, our state demographer, again, will be presenting to us via Zoom on the various demographic products involving our census data specific to Nevada. So again, welcome back, Mr. Lawton. Thank you for joining us, and please begin when you are ready.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Let me share my screen so I can bring the presentation up. And you should see my title slide. Is that correct?
We see it, Mr. Lawton.
Great. So again, Matthew Lawton, Nevada State Demographer in the Department of Taxation for the record. So I was asked to present to this committee some of the census trends from the 2020 decennial census data that has been released. So I will go through and give some of the high-level summaries of some of the trends that we're seeing in the data that has been released to date. And I also thought it would be a good opportunity to introduce myself, being new to the position. Some of you may be familiar with Mr. Jeff Hardcastle, who is the previous Nevada State Demographer for 20 years. I believe he presented to this committee. So I have succeeded Mr. Hardcastle in this position. He retired at the end of June. So a little bit of information on who I am. I come to the position with quite a bit of experience in the information technology and geographic information systems field. I have 18 years of experience working for local government, specifically here in Nevada. I worked with Washoe County and most recently with the municipality of Carson City. Professionally, I have experience in project management, data analytics, process improvement, but I'm still a geographer at heart, and yes, that is my license plate. So if you see me driving around on the roads, please be kind. Maybe don't honk at me. So the responsibilities of the state demographer, there are several statutorily required reports and publications that the State Demographer's Office produces, foremost being the annual Governor's Certified Population Estimates. Those are signed by the Governor on March 1st of each year. They are a representation of the previous year's state population as of July 1st. So the July 1st, 2021 estimates will go to be signed by the Governor this coming March 1st, 2022. In addition to that, those estimates, there's also a 5-year population projection series that accompany those estimates on March 1st. And then there's also a 20-year population projection series that is published on October 1st. Those were just released a few weeks ago on the Demographer website. And they also project the state population by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin cohorts through that 20-year series. Other statutory requirements of the office, I participate as a member of the Economic Forum Technical Advisory Committee. I also work in cooperation with the U.S. Census Bureau in preparation of the decennial census. I receive parcel and housing data annually from the local assessors' offices, and I also have a couple of agreements and MOUs for the office. One is with the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates. This is a group that's facilitated by the Census Bureau that brings representatives from all 50 states together to discuss methods of population estimation. And I also help support our state data center affiliate, which is currently under the Nevada State Library and Archives. So those are some of the additional functions of the office. Specific to the census, the demographer has a general charge to improve knowledge about the census and to encourage data quality in the census product. Again, I mentioned that there's the federal state cooperatives for population estimation. There's also one for population projections. They meet twice a year, once in the fall, once in the spring. So I participate in those groups. I also assist the Census Bureau with data gathering efforts. Things like vital statistics data that gets forwarded to them annually, and also communicate with local stakeholders. When I was in my previous position with Carson City, I worked with Mr. Hardcastle to prepare address data in preparation for the census at the local level. So that's an important function of the demographer. And also the demographer supports count review initiatives to ensure data quality. This happens post-census to review the data and check for the accuracy of those counts that were performed during the decennial census, and also function to facilitate access to the data and disseminate it to stakeholders. So that's something that I receive questions and requests on a regular basis through my office, is how to access census data and get it out there so that people can actually use it. So when we look at the census products that have been released, it's really important to understand that we're really in the middle of the data release series. There are 5 major products that are planned to be released for the census, and we've only had 2 of them released so far. The first one was back in April when the apportionment results were released at the state level. This was that data that determined the congressional representation for the various states. Nevada, we retained the 4 House of Representatives seats that we had previously. Some states did change as far as losing or adding representatives. Then in August, we heard a lot of news in the media about census data being released. This was actually the second file. It was the Public Law 94-171 file, as it's called, for redistricting. And this is the data that we're essentially talking about this evening. So this is data down to the block level, which is the smallest census geography. And it includes population totals for state, county, tract, block group, block level, as well as race and ethnicity information, housing occupancy data, housing unit counts, and also group quarters population counts. Next up is the demographic profile. This is tentatively scheduled to be released in 2022. This is when we will get our first in-depth look at the age makeup of the census data in 5-year groups. We'll get some sex information, as well as additional cross-tabulation of race and ethnicity by age and sex, and then also more household data, things like household type, family, non-family, tenure of the household, home ownership. After that will be the demographic and housing characteristics file. That geography is typically down to the block level, but that's still being determined by the census. Again, we'll get more cross tabulations of age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin, more household data, more characteristics of group quarters, and things like household characteristics for marital status, cohabitation. And then the detailed demographic and housing characteristics file will be released at some point. They don't have a date determined yet for that. And this is the most complex data joins and cross tabulations of the data that will be released in the series. So we still have a little ways to go for getting all of that data from Census 2020. So taking a step back and just kind of looking at the overall trends that the data from the public law release showed us nationally, the last decade was actually a fairly slow growth decade nationwide. It was the second slowest population growth. Only the 1930s had a slower population growth nationally. There's fewer states, metropolitan areas, and counties that had rapid growth. Most counties nationally actually lost population. However, in Nevada, we were one of the faster growing states. We were actually the fifth fastest growing state behind Utah, Idaho, Texas, and North Dakota. We had a 15% population increase. Within Nevada, Clark, Elko, Lyon, Nye, and Washoe counties were the fastest growing in our state. There's a general trend in the 2020 census, and this has been happening for the last few decades of shifting rural population to metropolitan. Metropolitan areas gained 2% population proportionally. We went from 84.3% metropolitan to 86.3% metropolitan population. That held true in Nevada. Esmeralda, Eureka, Lander, Lincoln, Mineral, Pershing, and White Pine, they all posted population declines in the 2010 to 2020 decennial period. However, we have to remember that the census did take place April 1st, 2020. The data is reflective of that date, and that was in the very early days of the pandemic. Perhaps the pandemic will change some of these trends with the rise in telecommuting. Maybe things could shift, but that remains to be seen as more data becomes available. Race and ethnicity. Nevada is among the most diverse states in the country. We're the third highest in the Census Diversity Index at 68.8%. Only Hawaii and California have higher diversity index ratings. And we have the fourth highest diffusion score at 16%, behind Hawaii, Alaska, and Oklahoma. So what those rankings mean, so diversity is the representation and relative size of different racial and ethnic groups within a population. And the diffusion is a measure of how unconcentrated a population is in comparison to the largest racial and ethnic group. So in a nutshell, what that means is the chance that two people chosen at random among a population are from a different race or ethnic group. And Nevada scored very highly in both of those measures. Nevada's diversity is primarily driven by the Hispanic population. Hispanic is the second most prevalent race and ethnic group in all the counties but one. Mineral County does have the American Indian population as the second most prevalent group. That's where the Walker River Reservation is located. And if we kind of compare how we stack up nationally at the county level, we can see that Clark County is actually number 22 in ranking on the diversity index. So that's a very high ranking among 3,143 total counties in the nation. From there, in Nevada, Washoe County, Mineral County, they're in the 300s, and then it goes down from there. But overall, Nevada is very highly ranked among those diversity scales. Other groups such as age, we don't have a real detailed look at age at this point. We only have the data showing the 18 and over population versus the under 18 population. But the general trend of Nevada getting older holds up. This has been the trend for a while now. The proportion of the adult 18 and over population increased by 2.3% from 2010 in the state. The percent increase of over 18 population was about 18.6%, and the under 18 population only increased about 4%. So we are getting older, and that's primarily from migration. We have an older population that's in migrating adult population. So we'll get more of a look at that when we get that demographic profile data in 2022. For housing, there was a 9.1% increase in housing units statewide. The actual numeric change was just over 107,000 housing units added in the state, and our vacancy rate dropped by 6.2%. So what that means is that our housing units are fairly highly occupied. We're at 91.9% as of the census date occupancy. There may be some question as to whether the pandemic had something to do with that. Maybe people weren't moving around as much. They were staying in their households. But that's something that will have to be examined closer to see if there was an impact on the pandemic in that occupancy rate from the census. So as I said, there's still more to come. We're only 2 products in. There's still 3 to go that will provide even more clarity, more detail on things like age, sex, race, and ethnicity. We'll get more of those household characteristics for things like marital status and household type and so forth, and more characteristics of the group quarters population as well. But I know that was a quick summary of high-level trends. Here is my contact information, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Members, do we have any questions? Yes, we have a question from Assemblyman Levitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Lawton, for that presentation. I guess my only question is as you were going through the demographic information and according with the census, did you realize any inaccuracies that jumped out at you, or is there a way to kind of look for inaccuracies that potentially could have occurred during the census gathering and submission?
Yeah, I think the most telling would be in the housing unit counts. Those are comparable to data that's provided by the local assessor's offices. And in preparation for the annual estimates, I'm just starting to dive into that data to really see if there are any areas that maybe were undercounted or housing units that were not included. So I don't have anything definitive at this point, but that's certainly part of that count review that will be performed of the census data so that we can get a measure of what the true accuracy of the count was.
Assemblyman? Okay. Thank you, Assemblyman. Thank you, Mr. Lawton. We have a question from Senator Goicoechea.
As always, thank you, Madam Chair. And as always, the previous question piqued my interest. But again, I am concerned, especially in some of the rural areas, that we were probably undercounted because of the pandemic. There's, we clearly look at even census blocks, and then you look at Google Earth, and boy, we've got a lot of abandoned ranches and farms out there in the rurals. So, but there's nothing we're really going to do with this other than you're going to try and track it and verify it, I assume, through the state demographer.
There is a process with the census for count correction. So if we do find that there were households that were excluded from the count, we can make them aware of that. So there is a mechanism with the census. It won't alter the count as released, but it will identify that those units were not included in the count.
Now, if I may, Madam Chair, a follow-up.
Please.
Then will the state demographer pursue that, or will it be someone would call, say a local jurisdiction or a county would call up and say, hey, we're a little concerned about, we show we're 5% off or 3% off, and yet we don't have a house available in the whole county?
Yeah, it's actually both. So the demographer can't do it alone. The local jurisdiction would have to initiate that, but the demographer can assist with the process of submitting the count correction to the Census Bureau.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Not seeing any additional questions. Thank you so much, Mr. Lawton, for that presentation. And I will go ahead and close Agenda Item 5 and open Agenda Item 6, which is the review of how to draft redistricting plans and the overview of the technical components of the 2021 Reapportionment and Redistricting cycle. Thank you, Ms. Prowl. As I see you getting ready to present, Ms. Prowl is our Senior Policy Analyst and GIS expert from LCB's Research Division and will lead this presentation on technology and GIS matters. Ms. Prowl, begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Haley Prohl, Senior Policy Analyst and GIS Specialist with the Research Division of the Legislative Council Bureau. So today I'm going to give the same presentation I gave on Saturday and will give tomorrow. It is on the technical components of redistricting, including the software, which uses GIS technology, the redistricting database, as well as how to draft redistricting plans and how members of the public can submit plan proposals. So GIS stands for Geographic Information System, and it is a platform for displaying and analyzing location-based data, or essentially a mapping software that connects geography with data. It's really the technology behind redistricting and how district boundaries and draft plans are actually drawn. And I've included a few examples of GIS maps just to show what GIS is capable of. On the left is a map of election results by precinct for the 2018 Congressional District 2 race, with the color scales representing the percent winning margin of the candidate who carried the precinct, and darker colors indicating a higher winning margin, and the size of the symbols representing the total number of votes cast for the winning candidate, and large symbols indicating more votes cast. The map on the right is one of many that the LCB GIS team created with the 2020 census data as preparatory material for the 2021 redistricting cycle. It shows where the Hispanic or Latino population is distributed in the Las Vegas Valley, with darker colors indicating higher concentrations. Redistricting technology has come a long way. Today, we are fortunate to have high-powered redistricting GIS software for creating maps, but it wasn't always that way. In 1980, GIS was mainly a mainframe only. Redistricting was done on paper maps mainly, and map drawers had to wait overnight to see the impact of drafted plans when they made changes. So there's really only the ability to create a handful of maps per redistricting cycle. In 1990, we start to see the use of limited PCs, and PC GIS systems were first introduced and used. And depending on the processing speed of these PCs, the results of district characteristics could be viewed faster than in 1980. So there's now the ability to create hundreds of plans during a legislative session for redistricting. And in 2000 and 2010, PCs are now widely used. There was the advent of GIS software created specifically for redistricting, and map drawers could see the results of their district characteristics immediately. So although it may not be desirable, we do have the ability to create thousands of plans during a redistricting cycle. To redistrict using GIS, you really need two main inputs, geography and population data. In terms of geography, we get this data from the U.S. Census Bureau, who releases GIS format geography boundary files known as Tiger files on a yearly basis. And these boundary files are not only used by the Census Bureau to tabulate census data, but they're also used by the states during redistricting. And the Census Bureau releases these Tiger files for a whole host of geography levels, as shown on the right. But we are specifically interested in county, block, and voting district or precinct boundaries for redistricting. These are really the building blocks of districts in Nevada. And these 2020 geographic support products were delivered to the states earlier this year in January and February. So what are census blocks? Census blocks are statistical areas bounded by visible features such as roads and streams, and non-visible features such as property lines and county borders. They're generally small in area, but may be larger and more irregular in rural regions. They can also contain zero population. And census blocks nest within all other census geographic entities and are the basis for all tabulated data. And Nevada has over 57,000 census blocks in the state. Voting districts or precincts are another building block when creating district boundaries. These are areas created by counties for the purpose of administering elections. Precincts are geographically larger than census blocks and vary greatly in size across the state. Precincts are drawn based on the registered voter population and can contain up to 5,000 registered voters. And Nevada has 2,102 precincts, the bulk of which are in Clark County with about 1,200 and Washoe County with about 500. The second main GIS input for redistricting is the population data. The official redistricting population data set from the Census Bureau is called the PL 94-171 Redistricting Data Summary Files. These summary files are in table format for multiple levels of census geography and include the necessary population characteristics for meeting legal redistricting requirements, including total population, race, Hispanic or Latino ethnicity, and voting age population. And on the right is an example of a PL 94-171 summary file at the census block level. Each row corresponds to one census block in Nevada, and each has a unique identification code called a GeoID, which is in the very left column of the table. And this GeoID corresponds to the same GeoID in the census block Tiger file. So we are able to join the population data to the geography boundaries through a process similar to how one would join tables in Excel. And once this data is joined to the geography boundaries, we can now start building our districts. Under usual circumstances, this data would have been delivered to Nevada in March of this year, about 1 year after Census Day. But with the delay in 2020 census operations, this data wasn't released until August 12th of this year. There were further adjustments made to the 2020 census data that was previously discussed tonight, and that involved the adjustment pursuant to AB450 of the 2019 legislative session that reflects the reallocation of inmates to their last known residential address prior to incarceration, rather than the address of the facility in which they were incarcerated and counted at on Census Day. And these adjusted total population numbers are those numbers in the redistricting database and available for download on the legislature's redistricting website. Aside from the geography boundaries and population data, there's also political data in the database, including voter registration data and election results. This data was acquired from the Secretary of State's office and is used to assess the competitiveness of districts. The 2019-2020 Legislative Interim Committee on Redistricting selected 4 races from the past 3 election cycles to be included in the redistricting database. This includes the 2016 presidential race, 2018 Attorney General and Secretary of State's races, and the 2020 presidential race. The committee considered several criteria when selecting the races, including that the elections were statewide, partisan, competitive, or had a relatively small margin of victory, and occurred in recent years. It should be noted that political data is really just an estimate of competitiveness, and it is not an exact measure by any means. Election data is reported at the precinct level, but redistricting often takes place at the census block level, which is a much smaller level of geography than the precinct level, so the data must be disaggregated, and this process of disaggregation makes it less accurate and more of an estimate. So just a word of caution when considering political data. For the 2021 reapportionment and redistricting cycle, the legislature purchased redistricting software and hardware and hired additional technical staff, all at the recommendation of the 2019-2020 committee to conduct an interim study on the requirements of reapportionment and redistricting. The redistricting GIS software purchased is called Autobound Edge. It was purchased through Citygate GIS. 4 desktop software licenses were purchased for the legislature, 1 for each legislative caucus. Additionally, the web-based license was purchased for members of the public to be able to participate over the internet and submit redistricting plan proposals and communities of interest for consideration. LCB hired 4 GIS technicians to assist the legislature in a technical capacity with the software and the data, with 1 GIS technician being assigned to each legislative caucus as their dedicated technical expert. And the hardware purchase for the 2021 redistricting cycle includes workstations for the GIS technicians, as well as printers for maps. This is a screenshot of the desktop redistricting software for legislators. It includes many helpful tools to create plans and assess whether they adhere to the legal requirements for redistricting. On the bottom is an active matrix that updates population calculations for each district in real time whenever changes to districts are made. And there are also various types of reports that can be exported for any plan. The web-based redistricting software for members of the public, known as My Districting Nevada, operates very similarly to the desktop software. There's an active matrix that updates in real time when changes are made, and there are options for reports and a validation check, and it's really designed to be simple and easy to use. Note that the drop-down menu for Select Assignment Layer contains those 3 levels of building blocks for districts previously mentioned: counties, precincts, and census blocks. So users can toggle between these layers to assign a mix of these geographies to a district in order to accurately reach population targets. My Districting Nevada can be accessed through any device with an internet connection and by users who register with an email address. Users can draft redistricting plans for the Congressional, State Senate, and State Assembly districts and share them privately or publicly with others. Users can also create and submit communities of interest through My Districting. And any publicly submitted plans and communities of interest are posted to public web pages for anyone to view, download, or comment on. And more information on how to use My Districting Nevada, including English and Spanish version user guides, are available on the legislature's website. The public web-based redistricting application and the desktop software for legislators do integrate, so legislators can import public plan proposals to view, as well as the communities of interest. The images included on this slide are screenshots of the public pages that house a public redistricting plan or community of interest. And as of this evening, there are 27 public proposals for congressional districts, 2 for state Senate districts, and 1 for state assembly districts. And there remains 2 publicly submitted communities of interest. And in closing, I will just plug once again the legislature's redistricting website, which serves to supply legislators, stakeholders, and members of the public with information, data, and resources about the reapportionment and redistricting process in Nevada. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I'll now take any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Ms. Prohl. Members, any questions? I don't see any questions. So with that, I will go ahead and close this agenda item and open our final agenda item, which is public comment. So again, we're returning to our second opportunity for public comment. Again, in the interest of time, we ask that each person limit their comments to 3 minutes. We will start here in Carson City, and then we will move on to those on the phone line. So for anyone listening or viewing, please start calling in if you would like to make public comment. And with that, we can begin with our first public comment. Please proceed.
Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the committee. You know, I'm Holly Wellborn. I'm the policy director for the ACLU of Nevada. I wasn't planning on testifying tonight, but I'm hot from the presentation by the NDOC, and I just needed to make sure that we get some things on the record. First of all, only 8% of Nevada's population are serving life sentences. That means the vast majority of people who are currently serving time in the NDOC will return to our community. We are talking about 5,000 people who should have been reallocated in some manner. We filed public records requests with the NDOC to understand their processes. The Nevadans Count Coalition had reached out to give information to the NDOC on the best way to collect data from people. In our public records request, we asked for the process NDOC follows if it cannot find the last known residential address, the process the NDOC follows to verify the accuracy of the data, the process for reporting data from an inmate whose last known residential address is outside of Nevada. We were told we would receive it by February of 2022. There are mechanisms in place for counting transient persons. The census has clear guidance on counting the unhoused population. The survey should have included questions about what shelters they may have stayed at, what services they could have been receiving prior to prison. There are organizations and specialists who could have assisted with those who had trouble providing information, such as those that have developmental disabilities, etc. The fact that individuals with developmental disabilities are serving time in a cage is a conversation for another day, but there are people who could have come in and helped with that count. From my vantage point, these are just excuses. Once again, the NDOC blames COVID for their shortcomings. True to form, they refuse to work with us and community partners to do what's right for the nearly 12,000 men and women who will return to our community someday. With that, I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to make public comment? Yes, please, welcome back.
Once again, this is Eli Trimble, E-L-I-T-R-I-M-B-L-E. First off, I want to thank Haley Prohl and the whole research division for their work making my redistricting website and putting that out to the public. It's a great tool and pretty user-friendly, as user-friendly as you could get something like that. One thing I was really kind of surprised that I didn't hear about was differential privacy. So this kind of goes back to Senator Goycochea's question about when you select a census block and you're getting 0, but there's clearly a ranch there or some sort of other property. Because the census is not allowed to release personally identifiable information for 72 years after the last census, or after the census it was taken, what they've had to do this time is introduce error. And so each, on the lowest levels of the precinct and block data, there is error built into these. And so you get you get noise, you get statistical noise. And as you accumulate these blocks and these precincts, that noise starts to disappear. The truly accurate counts are the census or the county data, but below that they've added noise. This is from the Census website. The redistricting data will be the first. Sorry, the redistricting data will be the first 2020 census data protected using differential privacy. This modern method protects individual information while letting us share important statistics about communities. By design, we've carefully calibrated how much protection or noise to add so that the results strike a balance between data protection and precision. With these parameters, some small areas like census blocks may look fuzzy, meaning that the data for a particular block may not seem correct. Importantly, our approach yields high-quality data as users combine these fuzzy blocks to perform more significant geographic units like census tracts, cities, voting districts, counties, and tribal areas. Our calibration was designed to achieve acceptable quality thresholds for these levels of geography. So, as you are reviewing the data to build districts, keep in mind that if you're having to tie together districts using block data, that may not be entirely accurate to what that population is. For instance, there was a block down in Clark County that I noticed had 386 people assigned to it and was a vacant lot. And that's because of the differential privacy that the U.S. Census Bureau is applying. So I really encourage the committee to kind of look into possibly getting more accurate data, at least at the precinct level, from the Census Bureau. But if not possible, avoid using block data or using the block level stuff.
Thank you, sir. And once again, you are welcome to submit all of your comments in writing. Thank you. Anyone else that would like to approach to make public comment? Broadcasting, do we have anyone on the phone lines? We don't have anyone else here in the committee room.
Good evening, Chair. It looks like we do have one caller. So if you would like to participate in public comment, please press *9 to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits, 944, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You have 3 minutes and you may begin.
Hello, my name is Ana Villatoro. That's Villatoro. I am here with Children's Advocacy Alliance. Children's Advocacy Alliance is committed to ensuring that every child in Nevada has the opportunity to be safe and healthy with the ability to enter school ready to learn and succeed in life. We are also committed to ensuring that all redistricting processes and maps are created fairly and that they represent our children and their communities accurately. Redistricting is supposed to be one person, one vote, so we ask you to remember that children cannot vote but will still be counted in this redistricting process. Please think of them as a population of interest when drawing your maps to ensure that the distribution of children is equitable across districts so their interests and future are represented as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Broadcasting, do we have anyone else on the line?
Yes, Chair, we do have one more caller that joined us.
Okay, do we have anyone on Zoom? I'm sorry, do we have anyone on Zoom that has joined us?
Yes, Chair, we have one caller.
Okay.
Caller with the last 3 digits, 490. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You have 3 minutes and you may begin.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cyrus Ojati, CYRUSHOJJACY. Hope you guys are having a great evening today. I just want to make sure that everybody's represented fairly, appropriately. And one thing I really am concerned about is gerrymandering. I hope that we really don't see any of that. I have seen a lot of this in North Carolina and Illinois. For instance, in North Carolina, they have a Democrat governor, but they have like 9 GOP House seats. We really don't want to see any of that. One area that I've seen gerrymandering is obviously Clark County, and you can see how they don't have one district that only covers the outer fringes of the county. You'll notice how the district boundary lines, how they do it is much different than the CCUSD boundary lines and the legislative boundary lines. This is one of the reasons why I was a supporter of the citizenship question, because it institutes fairness. My relatives were able to get citizenship. There has to be a difference between you're a U.S. citizen or not. It also makes sure that if things get out of hand, then the boundary lines don't have to change. Now, of course, you cannot deny that there is a border crisis that we're having in this country. And let's just say if 1 million happen to flood into the state of Nevada, yes, that will have an impact on the district boundaries. And that will also mean that the power and the influence of one person will be in jeopardy. So this is why, because we want to make sure that we don't incentivize that behavior. And keep in mind, if they have children, that is also a factor in population. But other than that, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity, for this meeting, and we look forward to represent everybody's voices in the next legislative session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, caller. Again, the phone number is 1-669-900-6833, and you would enter the meeting ID number of 856-3326-1783, followed by the pound sign. Broadcasting, do we have any other callers on the line?
Chair, the public line is open and working. However, there are no callers at the time. Would you like a brief pause to see if anybody else calls in?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Chair, the public line is open and working. However, there are still no callers at this time.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So with that, I will go ahead and close public comment. And seeing no business before us, I would like to remind the committee and the public that we will hold our next meeting tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. in Fallon at the Churchill County Commission Chambers. Again, that will be at 9:30 a.m. in the morning. So I hope to see you all there. Members, I know I'll see you all there. So again, thank you everyone for participating in this evening meeting. And with that, we are adjourned.